Welcome back to week 2 of Fit with Mitch. Send strength and conditioning coach Mitch Freeburn here. Last week we introduced what the early stage of the strength component of our off-season looks like for our players. Now this week I want to expand upon that and talk about the other half, or the other piece of the pie that we have to commonly work on, and that's energy system development. Early on in the off-season, one thing we really like to promote and work on is building the aerobic energy system capacity. So what does that mean? Basically what that is one, their ability to sustain workloads over long term, and then 2, being able to sustain those workloads can then help us recover faster and sustain these outputs the more you play throughout a game. Now, what is a practical application of what this looks like? Like I mentioned last week, there's a multitude of different options we can go with, but the common theme is we always start with a longer duration, longer time frame exercise. So somewhere in the 30, 35, 40 minute time ratio at a lower intensity. We can accomplish this many ways. In the gym here in Belleville, we have an Airdyne, we have a stationary bike, we have a treadmill. You can run outside. Like I said, there's a multitude of different options we can use to accomplish this goal. But basically what we're trying to build here is tolerance to workload and capacity to sustain outputs over longer durations of time. Another thing we like to really promote early on in the off season is the concept of cross training. Cross training meaning anything but hockey. So Jared Benoit, actually in Ottawa, is a huge advocate of boxing and what it can do for dynamic shoulder stability, introducing a little bit of chaos into that athlete's life while still getting the heart rate response and the elevated workload of actually physically sparring with a partner, doing bag work, etc. Other versions of cross training can be anything that complements or is totally different to hockey. So we recommend some players do tennis, badminton, get some moving in that frontal plane, similar to hockey, moving laterally, pivoting, cutting. Another example, beach volleyball, getting out in the sun, enjoying time with friends. Again, anything you can do to really promote, get that heart rate up, make you work above your resting workload while having a little bit of fun doing it. And then the final component we start to introduce after 1, 2, 3 weeks, depending where the athlete's at, is the concept of aerobic power intervals. Building off of the initial longer duration work, aerobic power is getting them to function at a higher intensity for longer durations, followed by a subsequent bout of rest. So, multitude of different prescriptions or methodologies here, but one example we can hit on is 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. Repeat 4 to 5 times, 6 times, depending on what your athlete's workload is, and also what the workload of their sport is. If they don't play hockey, if they do play hockey, think about what your sport entails, and then you can craft your program around there. But what does that look like? So when 3 minutes on, you want this to be hard. If you're using an RPE scale, which is a self-reflected scale, ask them how hard it is. You want them up in that 8-9 ratio where it's really hard. By the time they hit 3 minutes, they are tired and they are fatigued. After you hit that 3 minutes as our example here, then you'll 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So then you rest actively for 3 minutes. Take all the tension off if you're spinning on the bike and just recover. After that 3 minutes, we will repeat. And then, like I said, we can go 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds, depending on where our athlete's at and what our goal is for time under tension. So the one thing I will say, the only caveat or the alert I will give when I mention running, when you think of our players in specifics, on the ice, we skate, we don't get a lot of that ballistic ankle movement as such as a track and field athlete. So my one alarm to having them run is really watch the shin splints early on. How do we counteract that? Slowly over time, we can introduce running-based drills, ankle hops, ankle-based mobility, or just even shorter duration runs to casually build up that tolerance. If an athlete who doesn't run immediately jumps into a 5 or a 10K run, you can imagine how they're not used to that stressor, so how their body's gonna adversely react to that stimulus. So that's just one thing you wanna pay attention to. We prescribe running, but you just have to build up their tolerance progressively as they don't get that stimulus throughout the season on and off the ice. So to kind of summarize and collect all our thoughts from the past 2 weeks after we introduced early off-season programming and what it looks like. Again, everything I suggested and we discussed is just one possible option of a multitude of different ways you could all get to the same goal. Last week we talked about addressing the ankle, addressing the posterior chain, and then working on tension and restoring joint angles rather than that short, crouched, hunched position that hockey players are commonly in. This week we addressed energy system development, which is the other side and the other piece of the pie of what we like to work on early on in the off season. Collectively, after this period, we like to start building and expanding upon these concepts that we built on. So we'll start adding tension, but again, it all relates back to the point I made last week. The first phase of off season, we want to focus on creating the base of that foundation to build a stable product on top of that as we build into the later stages of the summer. I hope you found a useful tidbit or two that you could pull from this week's episode to use for your own programming or those you work with. Stay tuned next week where we'll dive deeper into our off-season programming and we'll learn where we progress to next.